In this place, Raymore, murder was committed. A man was killed. Killed over that. A passageway to a bog, worth nothing to anybody except those people who lived here and killed for it and died for it.
The Raymore mass murder was a huge event at the time. There were queues of people coming just to see the location where Massmore was murdered. It was unreal.
1958, it was the talk of the country. That time, there could be 2 murders in Ireland in a year.
He was strangled and his body was hidden in a drain.
He was shoved in underneath a ledge in the stream, and that was where he was hidden for 8 days.
Evidence was that he had been murdered, so they immediately suspected my uncle, Dan Foley.
Dan Foley and Massmore, they were neighbours and friends until they fell out because of a dispute over land. They were due in the Tralee Circuit Court a few weeks after the murder was committed, and Foley is supposed to have said there'll only be one of us showing up at this court case.
Dan Foley was a powerful man, terribly strong man, and he wouldn't be a man who'd kill out of plan, he'd kill with instinct.
Foley was never charged or convicted. A lot of people feel that maybe Dan Foley might have been innocent.
He did proclaim his innocence to whoever would listen locally. He proclaimed it to journalists, he proclaimed it to the guards.
Dan Foley was an innocent man. He did not murder Massmore.
And this murder might have been consigned to history if it hadn't provided the inspiration for a play written by my dad, John B. Keane. And I think he wrote the field to show kind of in a nuanced way exactly what happens to you yourself when you kill someone. And also, you know, that we have this in us and we have to watch it and be careful of it.
But most people know the field was based on a true story and couldn't tell you anything about the original killing. That's the interesting thing. They know that there's a germ of truth in it, but they don't know what that germ of truth is. The art is more important than the events that inspired the art.
It's been glamorized. The field turned this into a glamorous story that was attractive to people on the stage and in film all over the world.
1958, a murderer escaped justice. Somebody got away with it, and it's always fascinated me. Dad, and most people, I would say, felt that Dan Foley was most likely the murderer. But the more I look at it over the years, I've second thoughts about that. Foley could well have been an innocent man.
Dan was a big, strong, straight, hard-working man. He was a self-sufficient man. He never wanted for anything from anybody. Dan Foley and Massmore were the best of friends. They done everything together. They cut the turf and saved the hay and done every little chore together until, of course, such time as the difference between them arose.
In fact, a sign of their friendship was the fact that their land was separated by a sort of a sod ditch. They removed this sod ditch and they agreed that at some point they would put up a fence. The problem arose when Dan Foley put up the fence on his own without checking with Massmore.
The country was so open, it had to determine boundaries in the area, you know, so he thought that he had some right to the bit of ground, and Dan wasn't disputing any, whether he owned it or whether Massmore owned it. He was only trying to restrain his cows from wandering, so it developed anyway, and there was a court case pending.
Moss didn't want a confrontation. He decided the best course was to go to the law, and so he took him to the circuit court for trespass. Basically, he wanted compensation for Dan Foley having taken a half an acre of his land. And that's what led to the falling out between what previously had been neighbours who cooperated and friends.
Moore had feared for his life, and he had gone to the guards to say he thought that Foley was chasing him and stalking him, and the guards said they could do nothing. It was a civil case. It was going up before the court. And the next thing, one night, Moore was going home from a card game and didn't arrive home.
On the night of the murder, Moore would have done his usual thing. He would have gone down to Collins's down at the Raymore cross for his game of cards, and they would have started about, I don't know, maybe 7 o'clock in the winter time, in the dark, bad evenings, and they would have finished around 9 or 9:30. So Moore would have taken a shortcut across the fields and come in here into his own house.
From here on in, it's speculation, but it's speculation based on the evidence that was uncovered afterwards. It's believed as he came towards his own house, he was confronted by Dan Foley. There was a fight. Moss suffered a badly bruised nose. His nose was bleeding, his lips were bleeding, he suffered bruising around the eyes. That didn't kill him though, because the autopsy was clear on that. He was actually strangled to death.
His voice box was broken, so there was a lot of force involved.
Now, Dan Foley ended up with scratch marks on his face. He said that he'd got them in a tussle with a bull, but the coincidence is too strong. They were around the time of the fight.
He was shoved in underneath a ledge in the stream. It was the stream, you could jump the stream maybe, you know, it wasn't that wide. And that was where he was hidden for 8 days.
The first day that Moore had been reported missing, a report went into the Garda station at Tralee that Moore had been murdered. Moore was only missing at the time.
Immediately, the neighbours assumed, or said whatever you like, that he was murdered. No, they didn't even know that he was dead at this stage. They had no proof. But they said, oh, he's murdered, he's murdered, he's murdered. And sure enough, there was a big hue and cry, and hundreds of people went around the place, absolutely compromised the crime scene.
The search for Moore's body was a chaotic shambles, if we're honest. What happened was all the locals started looking. They searched ditches, they searched borders of fields. They didn't find anything in that initial search, and as the days wound on, they began spreading further and further out in the search, moving further away from where they actually should have been.
They were saying that time, like, that he fell into a bog hole somewhere. You know, people were thinking everything. But there was only one thing to think of, that whoever killed him knew what he was doing and knew where to put him.
Well, Mikey, it's a long time ago now since the happenings up in Raymore.
It is a long time back, all right.
It is. You were, I think, 18 when it happened, was
18
it?
or 19, you know.
Yeah. The search
Yeah.
for Moss, it went on for, was it 8 days?
Oh, 7 or 8 days.
Yeah. It must have been tough going on the family.
The search was tough going on the family, without a doubt. And tough going on everyone that was at it, like.
Yeah, the weather.
Because the weather was bad. And the terrain was rough. You could be walking down and someone wouldn't see him nearly.
Yeah.
After about a week, it was decided to start at his house and begin spreading out. And on the 8th day, a guard was in the west ditch where the body was eventually found with a stick poking, and he poked something that felt soft. And when he dug it up, it was a cap, and it was identified as Moss's cap. And sure enough, about 40 yards away from that, they finally found Moss's remains, wedged in to the edge of the stream, covered by overhanging vegetation. The guards were not used to handling a big crime. It was a small, rural part of the country, and to a large extent, they were doing a search and rescue operation. They weren't doing a murder investigation until they had the body, so they weren't treating it like a murder investigation. It meant that when they finally had a crime scene to examine, all they had was muck and footprints. There was no crime scene to examine. It had been destroyed because the guards hadn't locked it down.
The house behind me, Moore's house, was open to the public, more or less, and there was no crime scene or anything like that. They held a kind of a wake or something in the house. Any evidence that was there was destroyed. They hadn't the same means, I suppose, then as they have now in terms of DNA.
It was a media circus, and one of our first media circuses. The crime itself was shocking, and in 1950s rural Ireland, that was rare.
My parents, Padraig and Joan, were working on this story. It was a really big story at the time. Cameras were pretty new at that time. It was a bit of a novelty to be photographed. People were quite charmed to have their pictures taken. You can see even some of the guards in the picture are smiling for the camera and so on. And you didn't have a television service in Ireland at that time, and people really depended on those images and the print media to tell the story.
It was a huge story. It made all the papers. We had no television, but it made the radio. And it was a story that people talked about with horror.
If Dan Foley killed Moss Moore, Dan got away with murder. But if Dan Foley didn't kill Moss Moore, that killer stayed walking among the community for how many decades after getting away with murder?
Mike, I'm curious to see the contemporary newspaper reports from the time of the murder.
Yeah, this is the Kerry man. This is the second half of year 1958. First mention we get of it is here on the 15th of November with a headline there, Billy.
Oh, the headline, riddle of missing Raymore farmer. So at this stage, he's been missing for 9 days. I think the body was actually found on that day, Mike.
It was.
Saturday,
yeah.
November 15th.
Then the following week, on the 22nd.
Yeah, this is
a week after
later,
the body has been
and
recovered.
Then the headline then is, was Moss Moore strangled and thrown in stream?
But then the following week, in the Kerry man, they come straight to the conclusion, police search for Raymore man's murderer.
Yeah. And they get straight to the point. Who strangled Moss Moore? Question mark.
Yeah. And then the story continues on page 12 of the paper as well then, so this piece here.
Yeah, murder hunt continues at Raymore. Police have been able to establish the deceased had about £1 in his possession the day before he died, so there was a lot of talk about a robbery.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at it logically, there are only a few possibilities. Was Moss killed for money?
He is obviously robbed. My uncle's theory was that somebody was searching the house, and when he returned, he found them, and because he identified them, they had no choice but to kill him.
It seems that Moss Moore had sold cattle and he had money in his pocket, and when he was found, there wasn't any money in his pocket. And then we have here 2 dogs hold a secret. The dogs had been locked up when the murder committed, and then somebody left the dogs out.
Yeah.
The notion is whoever let the dogs out was the murderer.
Yeah.
The dogs, of course, there was a collie.
No, left out, like.
And a greyhound, they were left out.
Yeah.
And at the time, they seemed to be locked up the night of the murder.
They were always locked up.
Yeah. So who left them out?
Well, good question, like.
My uncle, he always went out and checked the cows at night. On that particular night, he said that he see the outline of a guy on the skyline because Where Mossmoor would have been was an elevated position, so that like there was definitely somebody else in the area the night, but he never could decide who that person was.
There was never enough evidence to charge Foley for it. The only evidence was that they fell out over land. A lot of people feel that maybe Dan Foley might have been innocent. For example, the deceased man, his flash lamp was found in Dan Foley's turnip garden. But why would you hide something in plain sight in a turnip garden? There was bogs and ditches and every place to throw it.
The body was in a stream that my uncle used the water for the house, for making the tea. That was their source of water, that stream. I don't think I'd drink water from a stream if I knew there was a body inside it.
Dan Foley was the obvious suspect. Right from the start, the Guardian knew that there were tensions between the two men. All the locals were pointing the finger at Dan.
They were due in the Tralee Circuit Court a few weeks after the murder was committed, and Foley is supposed to have said there'll only be one of us showing up at this court case.
He said there'd only be one man around for that court case, he said.
And what did you take that to mean?
Well, that someone, the two of them were going to be dead. I think Dan Foley killed him. How did he know that there'd only be one man around?
Everyone knew of the tension between the two men, and often a community knows what's going on beneath the surface. Everyone knew the court case was looming. So even though it seems like a leap now, at the time, it wasn't such a leap.
Everybody there believed that he did the murder. And in a way, I suppose he was kind of condemned by his own people to a terrible life, a life of exclusion and loneliness.
Shortly after it was found that Mossmoor had been murdered, nasty things happened in North Kerry.
They were boycotted. Nobody spoke to them. Nobody had anything to do with them.
It started with Dan Foley not being served in the local shop. It moved on to the fact that the local creamery wouldn't take his milk.
Kilduff Creamery had on the wall daubed boycott. People were very nasty. They ostracised him. They wouldn't help him with the farm.
He had to run the farm on his own without help, which was very difficult in those days because it was in a pre-machinery age. You needed the labour. He didn't get the labour. But the fact that somebody would do that shows the depth of feeling.
The people who were guilty promoted the boycotting of my uncle. It was to their benefit to take the spotlight off themselves and throw it onto my uncle. That was really the basis for the boycott.
But it became a lot more vicious than that. There was an active campaign of hate against him. At one point, shots were fired through his window.
A few of the neighbours got together. We came to the conclusion the right thing to do was to fire a few shots and to frighten him anyway. Some people said that it's a pity he wasn't shot. So to me it wouldn't be the right thing to do, but at the time anything could happen.
I was there on one particular occasion where there was a bomb placed on the ditch across the road and it exploded, and my God, it frightened the living soul out of everybody in the house that night.
The Kerryman of the 7th of November, a year later in 1959,
Oh, yeah.
on the front page, carries a report there.
Shots fired through the window of house at Raymore. And Dan says, I suppose this is part of the boycott that has been enforced against me, but I don't know what it's about, he says. The fact that he was kind of bullied so much afterwards, it went beyond, and what the sinister forces kind of pushing that to make him look bad.
People say he was broken by the boycott. He aged visibly. He put on years. He became tired and old.
You can imagine if you were accused of something that you didn't do, the pressure, he just couldn't cope with it. He went out one evening to bring in the cows and he collapsed and died on the roadway, which was really sad. There wasn't just one person murdered in Raymore. There was 2 people lost their lives as a consequence.
So, Mike, can we take it that after the attack on the house and the boycott, that's it? There isn't any more about the case after that?
Well, until your dad writes the play in 1965.
Yeah. So it all started off again?
It all started again.
It was kind of catchy to promote the play, to latch it on to something that was controversial at the time. You know, it gave it impetus, or it gave it importance, you know, the play. So, look, fair play to him, it worked for him, but it didn't work for the Foley family.
This is Clogher Church in the parish of Ballymacalligat. And this is where the Moors and also the Foleys would have worshipped. In fact, Moss Moore's funeral mass took place in this very church. Father Michael O'Donoghue was the parish priest, and about 10 days after the funeral mass, he called on the people of the parish to provide any information they had to the Gardaí about the murder. About a year later, the Bishop of Kerry, Dennis Moynihan, sent a letter to both priests in the parish. And Father Michael, he read out the letter to the parishioners. And in that letter, there was a threat that from now on, if there was any outrages, any crimes committed in relation to land or disputes over land, the perpetrators would have to go to the bishop for confession. It was known as a reserved sin. My dad picked up on all this and he wrote about the bishop in the play. The bishop gave a very powerful statement about keeping secrets over murders, and he called it the silence of the lie. I remember this was 1959. It was a different Ireland. The church were very powerful, and the bishop in particular could literally strike the fear of God into people.
Inform on the Bull McCabe. That, of course, is not the case. There was no silence from the Raymore murder. They had him hanged and quartered long before any trial came by.
I actually tried to stop the showing of the field. You know, I tried to get a court injunction, but I failed. I don't know how important that was, but I tried. It was not a good thing for the Foley family. You know, people would look at you and say, oh, that's John Foley, or that's Mick or Tom or Jack or whatever, you know, that you were related to Dan Foley.
When John Dee brought out the play in 1965, it was a huge success and brought back the whole thing again. And Dan Foley's people are adamant that Foley didn't commit the murder, and actually a lot of them have left the country as a result.
My dad's intention to hurt in any way the Foley family. The character in the play might be influenced by Dan Foley, but it's a mix of several other people and imagination.
I defend my uncle and will continue to do until such time as I will have the opportunity to name who Dan Foley said murdered Moss Moore, but I can't do that now.
The amazing thing now is that John Foley bought the land back where all this happened, back in the Foley name again. As regards the financial, commercial, farming, money-making proposition, it's not worthwhile at all.
Because of the sentimental issues involved and the injustice that had happened there, I said that I would own that bit of ground no matter what it cost me. So that's how it happened.
In a way, there's a morality tale here jumping out at us. If Dan Foley did do the murder, if he killed his neighbour and his one-time friend, fair enough. He's guilty even though he was never charged. But what if he wasn't the murderer? It meant that there were people who committed murder, who ruined a man's life, and it's unresolved. Murder victims' families always talk about closure. There has been no closure in Raymore.
Interestingly enough, John B. Keane always was certain that it was Dan Foley that committed the murder, but his good friend, the editor and owner of the Kerry newspaper, the late Padraig Kennelly, who investigated the thing for the paper and reported on it for several months and had several conversations with Foley, was absolutely certain that he didn't commit it at all.
My father built up a really great friendship with Dan Foley. He would go up to the house and bring a fuller's cake and they'd drink tea and chat for a couple of hours. And my father was convinced that Dan Foley was innocent. In fact, I believe there was some controversy at the time. My dad had a picture in the window of his shop in Ash Street of Foley, which proclaimed him to be an innocent man, and he got into some difficulty with regard to that particular picture. My dad, I think, had some theories about who might have been responsible, but he wouldn't share them with us. He kept a sealed lip on that story, but he was quite certain that Foley was not the man.
He did proclaim his innocence to whoever would listen locally. He proclaimed it to journalists. He proclaimed it to the guards. There was enough evidence there that the Gardaí felt he was the viable suspect, and in the end a file was prepared and it was sent to the state solicitor. But when the state solicitor looked at the case, he decided it wasn't strong enough to go to trial, and nobody was ever charged formally in connection with the murder of Mossmore. After meeting locals, after walking the land, after reading all the original accounts and going over it in my head, I don't see any other viable suspect. I am completely satisfied that Dan Foley did kill Mossmore.
You think the court case was the reason for the murder?
Yes.
And if the court case was the reason for the murder and Dan Foley was on the other side of it, do you think he did it?
Well, my opinion, like the fellow said, I wouldn't say he did or he didn't.
Yeah. You couldn't be 100% sure?
I couldn't be 100% sure.
Would you think he was a suspect?
He had something to do with it, you know.
He had something to do with it?
Yeah.
I've no doubts in the world about it. No one else killed Mossmore, only Dan Foley.
Was it all worth it?
Not at all.
I know and I'm totally convinced that my uncle was wronged, and I don't like people being wronged in such a serious matter. It has caused me great grievance and great trouble over the years. I've faced up to the situation as best I can. I have no problem defending Dan Foley because I know I'm doing the right thing. There are those people advising me, look, let it lie. It cost Dan Foley his life, it cost Mossmore his life, and it has brought this whole place into desolation, into ruination, if you like. I don't know.
60-odd years later, we're still talking about this case, where other cases have been consigned to the filing cabinet of history, because it is actually unsolved. It's still an open cold case. We may never know for certain who killed Mossmore.
The more I know about what happened in Raymore, the less I know. Every time you find something out, it sends you off in 3 or 4 different directions. I always felt Dan Foley was innocent. I now feel he's a suspect, but there is nothing we've discovered that would even remotely lead to him being convicted of a murder. It's good to be back here with you again, John.
You're welcome, Billy.
You've always been a steadfast supporter of your Uncle Dan.
Yeah, I always stood up and told anybody or everybody Dan Foley was an innocent man.
I'd like to say to you that on behalf of my dad, you know, he's dead and Dan is dead, but I'd like to say to you that my dad didn't base it on Raymore word for word. It was a very broad outline. I hope everybody realises that when they look at the movie, when they go to the play, that they'll realise this is not Dan Foley that's appearing on stage here. Yeah. I hope that's of some comfort to you, John, because I know how much you've been through, and we really feel for you as a family, our family. So I just want to say that to you.
I never had any animosity or any bad feelings in relation to John B. or to the play. The whole thing never related, in my mind, to Raymore.
The one thing I can't understand, I understand you're sticking up for your uncle. It's not a cut and dried case. Nobody knows what happened really up there. But what I can't understand is you bought the place back again, John. You bought back Uncle Dan's land. I
did, yeah.
Maybe I'm a townie, maybe I don't get it as much, but I just feel this thing, and I think my dad did as well, that like it's just not worth it. Like it's causing, you're just getting into more trouble, and then the next generation will be landed with it and they'll wonder, what are we going to do with this? Are we letting down our father? Are we letting down our grandfather? Are we letting down our great-grandfather? And do you see where I'm coming from?
Land is, in my opinion, something that you can't just acquire or get. It doesn't grow. Land is land. There was so much of it made, it won't multiply or it won't increase. Ownership of land is, in my opinion, everything. And I hope that those who follow me will have the same sentiment and pride in owning Raymore.
You think you know who committed the murder?
Yes.
Yes. So why then don't you make a complaint to the Gardaí? It's a murder never ends. There's no such thing as a cold case. It just goes on forever.
And my family are of the opinion that maybe I should call it a day and say no more about it.
Okay.
That murder still resonates to this day, here especially in this area. It resonates among the younger generation because of the genius of John B. Keane, who brought the murder to us, and people know the background. There are still people alive who remember the murder. It takes over 100 years for these things to be forgiven and forgotten. Now, you can forgive, but maybe you can't forget. And John B. Keane has made the murder unforgettable.